thanks for coming, because I know it's a really rough time of the year, this time of the year. We particularly picked this week to run this because we thought, well, you know, teaching has just ended, so that always gives us a lift in spirits before we start thinking about all the marking that's going to face us from next week on. And also it's sort of that little period of time in which maybe we do take a breath and we think about what's happened in the modules that we've just finished and maybe how we might want to change them. And sometimes what happens is that we think about that in a vague way, and then the next thing we're into marking and we're into other things, and it never maybe quite happens that we make those changes. So really the purpose of today is to just be able to spend the morning just thinking about assessment and feedback, and that's sort of a luxury that often as academics we don't have because we're rushing on to the next thing. And also what we hope to do today is to provide some inspiration of ideas that you might go, that would really work in that module for me. So that's really what the purpose is. And so what I want to do is to start with by, I suppose, thinking about this idea of an ecosystem. So when I started thinking about, how to set the context for today, I was thinking, well, really, we can think about assessment and feedback as an element within the education ecosystem within which we work. And so that's really what I want us to start thinking about, and then we'll move into the more specifics. So we all know assessment and feedback is really important, but what the literature particularly highlights is that it shapes what and how students learn. And sometimes we focus a lot on what we are going to teach them in our modules, what our content is. But really it's assessment that guides what they do. So we all have the issue this week where our attendance is really bad because they're saying, why will I come? I've already done the assessment and the exam is next week. And so actually what makes students learn is the assessment, because that's what measures their learning, if you like. And so it really guides all of their learning rather than the content, which is maybe what we tend to more focus on. And then Sadler talks about the importance of feedback and how feedback is central to the development of effective learning. And in reality, all of you in the room are already converts to the importance of assessment and feedback, or you wouldn't be here. But actually, it's the feedback that makes the student learn from the assessment and to think about, hopefully, how will I change things? How will I do things differently? And sometimes the feedback is seen as the end of learning by students. In the literature they talk a lot about this, how students just get the feedback from me and then go, that's over, thank goodness. Either I did well or I didn't do well. And again, we all have the experience of students who never come looking for the feedback, all they want is the mark, the number, that's all they're interested in. But actually, if we think about feedback and assessment in a loop, they should be, of course, using the feedback from one module to feed into how are they going to do things differently in the next assessment. And when we think of feedback in that way, we are thinking of it then fundamentally as something that affects their learning, and for us as lecturers, directly affects the way in which we engage with those students and the interaction that we have with them. But we know the importance of assessment and feedback, but we also know the challenges. And even we were walking over here, and we had a team meeting earlier on, and all of us were grumbling about this is the worst part of the job, is the marking. I don't think anybody will think that it's the best bit of the job. And there are huge challenges with assessment and feedback. From the student point of view, and literature shows that students find it difficult sometimes to understand the academic feedback, that they don't actually know what we mean. Also, perhaps what we think we've written down or explained to them, they've taken it up a different way. Not to say one is right and one is wrong, but there's something missing there in the gap of the exchange, be it verbal or be it written feedback. They fail to act on the feedback received, so we've already spoken about that. They fail to feed forward, and I did focus groups for different projects with students, and they said, but why would I use your feedback when I'm doing the next assessment? Because Catherine's looking for something different than what you're looking for. And so now we have been, in our induction, spoken and we started using standardised feedback forms to show students actually all of us in the 5 modules you're going to take this semester are all looking for the same thing. A 2-1 is a 2-1 whether I'm marking it or someone else is marking it. But that's quite a challenging thing to introduce to students. There's also challenges there in terms of being sure that we are all looking for the same thing, of course, from a staff point of view too. From a staff point of view, the key challenges is the workload. As we have bigger numbers of students, we have students with a bigger range of needs, a more diverse student population, and a pressure to feed back quicker. How do we manage that? That's a huge challenge for staff, and it's one that underpins a lot of the project that we've been looking at too. John mentioned earlier about the emotional response, about the idea that sometimes students see their comment on their work as a comment on them. And that there's a whole emotional issue then that's connected to thinking about how we give feedback to students, and also perhaps the sorts of assessments that we introduce. And again, at the moment, that's maybe more of an issue than it might have been 20 years ago in terms of current societal norms. So if we think then about assessment in this way, you see assessment and feedback is central to what we do, and key within that are the learners, the lecturers, and also the programme teams, we would argue. So this is the core of how we tend to think about assessment and feedback. But that's far too straightforward, if you like, because actually within the ecosystem that goes around all of these elements, we have a number of different issues which have to have an impact on the way that we do things. So societal issues. So that I mean, what are the norms and expectations as a society about what students should learn at college? About what sorts of assessment should they be doing? Has that changed over time? How do we differentiate between what assessment a student is doing in a university versus doing, or in a level 7 versus a level 6 or a level 8 or a level 9? What are the societal expectations around that, and then students' expectations as well? We have increased numbers of students. That creates huge challenges. And so, for instance, in my school, where we were moving from student numbers of maybe 30 to 40 when I started here about 20 years ago, now we can regularly have 70 to 100. So that creates challenges in terms of how are you going to physically turn around those sorts of assessment. One of my colleagues made a frightening calculation of the numbers of words that we were reading when we were doing 3,000 word assignments by 120 people sitting in the module. And how could we physically turn that around with feedback, even within a 3 to 4 week situation? So that increased numbers of students then makes us have to stop and think, what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with those numbers? And sometimes what that has led to is us changing our assessments, not necessarily for reasons to do with better assessments matching learning outcomes, but sometimes practical reasons. So we're seeing much more multiple choice types of assessments, for instance, being put into programs where you have big numbers, especially in first year. So that's creating challenges for assessment and also for feedback in terms of what's possible. Thinking even from an educational policy point of view, what are the norms or the policies around, how quick is feedback? What does it have to be? So we guidelines as to when our feedback needs to be given back. What is the expectation in terms of what's given back? I had a student come to me last week saying, well, the other student so it was to do with dissertations, the other student got a whole page of handwritten notes from their supervisor, and I just got the form filled out with a 4-line comment on it. Now, both lecturers or supervisors were within their rights to do what they did, and there was good reason for that. But the student looks at it and compares the numbers of words. We're doing a test exercise at the moment. Louise will be talking about that later in our programme, and we were asked for each of our modules to catalogue how many words feedback we give or how many minutes feedback we give, which is a really challenging thing to think about. But again, educational policies are sort of challenging us and maybe forcing us to do certain things or certainly to investigate them. Changing expectations. Students now have different expectations than they did 10 years ago, definitely 20 years ago, in terms of what they expect from us as academics, in terms of what they expect from us in terms of assessment and also in feedback. And so that goes through their whole educational experience, but also their assessment and feedback. And also if they have a good experience in one module, they're saying, well, why can't I have that in another module? And they're quick to tell us about it too, where before they might think it, but they weren't going to come and tell us, now they do. And we also give them the opportunity, rightly so, to do that through our quality sort of framework. Changing roles. So the literature talks about how we need to make a shift from assessment feedback being monologue to dialogue. So instead of me giving my student feedback and running out of the room before they ask me anything, or maybe emailing it to them and hoping nobody comes back to me, actually what the guidance now in the literature is saying is we need to be thinking about it as a discussion. Maybe a virtual discussion, maybe an actual verbal discussion. Some of the techniques you're going to hear about later in terms of things like audio feedback is, where you can give audio feedback and then the student come back and answer or respond to what your comments are. But this is a very different way of looking at assessment and feedback, and we're probably seeing the beginnings of that, but there's lots more going to change, again, that are going to impact us in here in that way. Graduate attributes are also key, and this was a key sort of overriding theme, I suppose, in the LEAF project, was thinking about how graduate attributes are explored within our assessment and feedback. And so it's challenging from an academic point of view. No longer are we expected to just examine and teach our students about our discipline area, but we're also supposed to be contributing to the development of their graduate attributes. And while we might include that in elements of our taught lectures or workshops, how are we actually assessing that? And again, we have to think differently about assessment and feedback if we want to be thinking about how we're developing graduate attributes. Higher education management, again, affects our whole ecosystem in terms of what the expectations are of us as lecturers. And so the lecturing role has changed quite significantly, again, probably over the last 2 decades, in terms of the other sorts of duties that we're engaged in. Not only is it now, the lecturing and the assessment and the marking, but we're playing roles in terms of pastoral, in terms of admin, in terms of perhaps policies, all of those sorts of things. So that has changed too. The students' working life. Students now, our students here, are working. Sometimes they're working full-time, they're definitely working part-time, and they're balancing the work with their lectures. They're making strategic decisions. My daughter is in first year in a different university, and she had friends over last night, and I was eavesdropping on the conversation. I was asking them questions about assessments because they were from 4 different institutions, and I was saying, so how many assessments did you do how many exams do you have? And of course my daughter was sniggering in the background because she knew that it was inside information I was looking for. But what they were told, then I heard them talking about lectures, and one of them was saying, well, there's not much point in going to lectures because the lecture doesn't really add much. Like, the stuff is all up online, so I only sometimes go to them. And I thought, that is what the modern day student is about. They are making strategic decisions about what's worth going to and what's not worth going to. And they are balancing their lives just like we balance our lives in terms of working out what do I really need to do and what do I choose to do. And so that has an impact on their learning and also their assessment, on their engagement with assessment, on how we assess. So Leanne's going to be talking about, early assessment, early feedback, so that they're not saying, well, I don't need to go to those lectures because sure, all I'm doing is an exam at the end. I'll start attending lectures halfway through. Technology, again, another overriding theme, and you'll see a lot of the tools that are going to be talked about later are related to using technology and us keeping up with the ways that technology can help us, in particular to give speedy feedback, which is, what we're being told is what we need to do. And technology sometimes can really help us to do that for students who are looking, especially in the early years, to get an idea of how are they performing. New teaching practices, so new ways of doing this. Is the future going to be things like this, me standing up here and people sitting down? What are the new teaching practices going to be? And where it may be harder for us to change our teaching practices, perhaps changing our assessment methods will allow us to flip our teaching practices a little bit. So if your assessment is going to be a group work which is going to happen within the room, then we're not going to be sitting like this anymore. They're going to be sitting in groups and I'm going to be moving around, facilitating rather than lecturing. So that's again going to change the way in which we do things. Changing student profile, already mentioned again. We have students with different types of needs and supports required than we may have had 20 years ago. And so again, we need to adapt our practices to suit that. And we do that all the time in our regular way in which we lecture, but do we adapt it in the way that we assess, the way that we give feedback? So really what all of this shows us is that in some ways we're in a very challenging situation as lecturers. We're in a situation where the environment around us is creating significant change and significant challenges. And so how are we going to address that? And that's really in some ways the starting point of what the LEAF project was how do we steady the boat for ourselves? Because a lot of the time we can feel like we are just firefighting. We are just working out how do I just get through the module? How do I just get all my modules up and running? And I suppose what LEAF wanted to do was to think a little bit more about, take a breath and think, okay, where are we and what could we maybe do differently? And so the LEAF project, learning from and engaging with assessment and feedback, is now towards its end. It's been a 2-year project, and what we've been mainly doing is, if you see at the top here, we've been trying to find where are we in terms of assessment and feedback as an institution. Are we keeping up with good practice? What's going on out there in the world that are the challenges that we need to look at? So you can see up here at the top, we looked at, well, what's the student view? What's the staff view? What's the literature telling us? And so some of those things you'll see I've commented on there. And also then the last group was, what are the experts? We did some key informant interviews with national and international experts to get a real feel about what are all the issues. We then brought all those issues back to the table and tried to identify, okay, what are the key challenges going on here? And so you'll see here in the middle on our leaf here, we have some of those key challenges and issues that were identified. And then what we decided to do is think about, okay, how are we going to address those issues? What sorts of things could we do to try and address issues around, for instance, dealing with graduate attributes, how to use technology more, how to deal with big class groups? And on the basis of that then, we have, you'll see here, 4 different levels of strategies that we're moving towards now. And the main thing we're going to be talking about today is on the module basis, where we trialled about 10 or 12 different tools to see, did they help us to address any of these sorts of issues? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But we are also thinking from the student perspective, thinking about how do we engage students more in the idea of assessment and feedback? How do we help them to understand what the point is of assessment and what to do with feedback? And so we're building resources around that. From a programme point of view, we've very much taken the line that really the key when we look at assessment and feedback is that it is not simply an individual's task within a module. Really dealing with assessment and feedback is a programme approach, and that's what we need to see it as, and we don't see it as that. I decide what's the best assessment for my module, and then I go off and do it. Nobody even knows what assessment I'm doing. And if you ask yourself, most of you probably, if you think about the programmes you teach on, do you actually know what the students in front of you are doing in other modules in terms of assessments? You probably don't. And that means then that actually we're not thinking about it from the student's perspective, and we're also not thinking about it in terms of, as a group, what combination of assessments are they doing? What combination of feedback are they getting? How does it all work together? And so again, we'll talk about that later in our school. We're taking a test approach where we're sitting down tomorrow and we're thrashing out across a number of our programmes what's happening in first year semester 1. What does the student get? And is it the right combination? Is it too much? How can we change things? So we're shifting assessment and feedback from an individual lecturer issue into a programme team issue. And in doing that, we hope that we're going to, first of all, make us explore it more and also create a much better experience for students and hopefully academics alike. And then at the institutional level then, we're starting to think about, well, how do we get assessment and feedback on the agenda? Because often it isn't really something that's on the agenda. So we're looking at issues from a quality point of view, programmatic reviews, our Q5s, those sorts of things, to say assessment and feedback needs to be something that we talk about, not something that we simply just do. And so that's, I suppose, a key issue that we'll be dealing with. And so we're at this sort of development of recommendations now at this point in the lecture. And so really what this brings us to is thinking about change. And the purpose of today is to provide you with some sorts of ideas that hopefully you can take away and go, I'm going to try that. Sometimes the biggest thing that puts us off change is the risk. Is that you think, oh, I'd like to try something new, but like, what if it doesn't work? And you know, what do I do if this happens or that happens, or the students kick back or it goes wrong? And I suppose what we want to do today is to shift a little bit of that risk away, because the I think it's about 10 tools we're going to talk about today, we have taken the risk. So different people in the room have risked trialling those tools in the classroom in a variety of programmes across the whole institute. And what we're going to give you is the feedback of how it worked. And so from that, you may see some things that you go, okay, I'll try it out. And the feedback is from students and staff, so it gives us a good picture about how the tools worked. And so we're hoping that will give some inspiration to take away that maybe you won't be able to deal with straight away because you're heading into marking times, but it'll stick in your mind to go, actually, I think I'm going to try that in September. And that's really what we're trying to do, is to effect this sort of change in terms of thinking about assessment and feedback. From it not being something that we simply go, oh, I can't deal with this, it's the 7th of September, I need all my modules up and running by the 16th, I'll just do what I always did before. We're trying to say maybe there's other ways to do things that are beneficial to the students, but also beneficial to us in terms of perhaps the workload or the time or the experience, just changing things around. And so that's really what we are going to do from now on. We're going to give 10 minutes GASTA presentations where people are going to present about the variety of different tools that they tried. You can see these are all the tools down here. So there's a huge amount of tools. Some more based on, we have a selection of ones that have been used in the arts, used in science, used in business sort of areas. So there's plenty of things to choose from. So I think who's first? Emma and Jane are going to start first.